The modern church is in disarray and deeply divided in its current state. The esoteric truths found in the Christian mysteries have been largely lost and discarded by the modern day Pharisees and heresy hunters, who have cleverly crafted the orthodox, meaning correct, view counterfeits in order to vilify those who have researched the history of the church and discovered that truth has been highly politicized and painfully distorted and even engrafted into a dogmatic, anti-mystical, anti-Gnostic, so-called heresy campaign. A recent example of this I discovered is in one of many films from the evangelical fundamentalist community designed to weed out the Gnostic heresies, so to speak. A film called Hollywood's War on God, with its many false assumptions given from an evangelical fundamentalist perspective for the most part, is a blatant discrediting and vilification of the inner Christian mysteries common to esoteric wisdom teachings and their intersection with Gnostic cosmology within the history of Christianity. It seems as though any alternative theology other than the one presented in mainline fundamentalist thought has earned the infamous title of Antichrist. In this film, that is, any other view which isn't Orthodox fundamentalist or Protestant evangelical Christian. Of course, this vilifying is nothing new. It's an ongoing and persistent paradigm. From the time of Jesus to present, this has existed. This infighting and Christian persecuting Christian, accusing each of being anti-Christ. What is wrong with that picture? In the churchianity of you versus me, it seems that dwells on the dualistic theology of the creation of perceived enemies without and within the church institution. If it's not Catholic Antichrist heretics, well then it's of course the Protestant heretics who are Antichrist. And not to mention the flying accusations and infighting and divisiveness which can be found within the thousands, yes, thousands of existing denominations and cults found within the whole of Christendom. So with this in mind, beware of those who are apt to ascribe to the devil things that they disagree with concerning spiritual matters. Although Satan's influence is pervasive and prolific these days, I wouldn't be so quick to ascribe other theological perspectives as having been sourced from the devil or a demon which is found behind every bush. With that said, I want to present the Backcover book report on Douglas Lockhart's work entitled Jesus the Heretic. Douglas Lockhart was born in Scotland. He trained as personal assistant to Dr. Maxwell Cade in the biofeedback department of the Franklin School of Contemporary Studies during the 1970s while writing short stories and books. Since moving to Australia in 1979, he has also written radio scripts and his first play. He is the author of The Paradise Complex, as well as this, Jesus the Heretic. And now a quote from the inside of the book from page 9, starting with the third paragraph. Quote, Roman Catholic Christianity eventually endowed Jesus with superlative wisdom and divinity, and out of this mythic move fell to imagining that it too had superlative wisdom. Alas, history does not agree. The persecution of those designated heretics is a sad tale, not often told enough. Oddly enough, Jesus too was a heretic. This is what eventually got him crucified by the so-called religious teachers of his day. The Apostle Paul inadvertently makes him so when in Acts he says, quote, But this I confess unto you, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers. Acts 24:14. Because he also claims to have received what he reaches or what he teaches from Jesus' own lips. 1 Corinthians 11:23. Jesus is, by definition, a heretic. And this is not to do Jesus an injustice, for in the light of his non-conformist teachings, and perhaps deeply mystical teachings and behavior, he was without a doubt a heretical figure in Jewish eyes, and if he returned today, he would likewise be a heretic in the eyes of the Christian Church. A quick definition of the word heresy, as found in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, plural heresies, definition: A. Adherence to a religious opinion contrary to church dogma. So, the title Hollywood's War on God, or is it Hollywood's War on dogmatic religious fundamentalism that would decry anything they disagree with as a heresy or worse, Antichrist? They were accused of heresy. Definition 2, denial of a revealed truth by a baptized member of the Roman Catholic Church. So anything that is denial of the revealed truth of the Roman Catholic Church is a heresy as well, which includes all of Protestantism. The third is an opinion or doctrine contrary to church dogma. Dissent or deviation from a dominant theory, opinion, or practice. An opinion, doctrine, or practice contrary to the truth or perceived truth or to generally accepted beliefs or statements. Our democratic heresy, which holds that truth is to be found by majority vote. M.W. Straight. So the question then is a perceived heresy an actual heresy, or is it an actual truth? After all, Jesus was the first heretic. And in Douglas Lockhart's book entitled Jesus the Heretic, Freedom and Bondage in a Religious World, he examines the concept and picks apart the notions. It is easy to believe that Jesus was sinless, sexless, and all-knowing, if that is all you have ever been taught. But what was Christ, the man, really like? Christians have been denied vital information concerning their religion, and Christ's true message has been lost in a sea of religious dogma. And to finish up this book report, I'd like to read a little more from the inner pages, from page 188. Quote, "Does Christianity depend on a grave that was empty, on a body that has been resuscitated, on angels that descend in earthquakes and roll massive stones away from the mouth of a tomb, or on a figure who can disappear into thin air after the breaking of bread? Does it not bother the literal believer that the details of the Gospels are as contradictory about what happened after Jesus' death as they are about what happened at the time of his birth? Is this not the last frontier? For uttering such words, people have been tortured and burned in the past. Today, things are a little different. The courageous are either verbally bludgeoned to death on radio and television talk shows, or by church propaganda, by clergy whose intellectual dishonesty is often blatant and occasionally frightening, or they are awarded withering smiles by those same illegitimate custodians of the Christian faith. I say illegitimate because in spite of their insignia and titles, they are predominantly locked in a mindset that has all but stifled the faith they claim to love so much, the faith that is dying under their very noses, doomed to disappear if its vital spiritual energies are any longer wasted in upholding a religious vision composed of allegorical surface stories reduced to fixed truths. Christianity is crying out for apologists to help cut the ship of faith free from its literalist and semi-literalist mooring. With this usual pithiness, Reinhold Niebuhr tells us that biblical faith must remain a commitment of the self rather than a conclusion of the mind. And then, commitment is not possible without the prerequisite of repentance, because the darkness about the meaning of its existence is due not so much to the finiteness of the self's mind as to the pretensions of its heart. This raises all kinds of questions, but suffice to say that repentance cannot be made into a catch-all philosophy to which we must all blindly respond, and commitment of the self begs the question of what it is one is committing oneself to. A commitment of the self to something greater than the self, if this is what Niebuhr is referring to, may indeed be necessary, indeed vital, for the little self to fully comprehend the larger self. But that commitment cannot properly be made unless it is sensibly backed by the finite mind. For once again, when all is said and done, repentance of the heart does not require anyone to believe in the virgin birth, or that Jesus walked on water, or that he was God incarnate. In fact, not believing in such things may well be a corrective spiritual step in alignment with myth and its resonance with being. And repentance for a guilt of the heart linked to some original sin is, if taken literally, a repentance built on the misnomer of intrinsic evil, and evil conjured into existence through a supposed act of disobedience to the will of God by beings designated our first parents. Rescued from the literal mind, the Genesis myth intimates not a fall, but a change of focus, a dramatic development in human perception, a perceptual and conceptual leap which carried the human race towards its first great evolutionary hurdle, self-consciousness. The naming of the beasts had started. The evolution of human perception to a point of which individuals became physically separated, then isolated, then cut off from their intuitive level and driven to despair in their most cherished relationships, demands a better explanation than that supplied by the Christian Church. To be told that it is all the result of our first parents having sinned against God and having passed on some kind of contagion is an insult to the finite intelligence which even Reinhold Niebuhr could not completely ignore. So, what is the answer? What happened way back then to cause this existential hiccup to surface later as an intimation of intrinsic evil? Are we collectively guilty of some deep physical misdemeanor? Or is it just that our ancient ancestors could not evolve without first creating a gap in perception across which to consciously stare? A creative gap that would rapidly grow until a complete sense of separation from world and other erupted and took center stage. What a moment that must have been for those individuals who first broke through into the realm of complete self-consciousness, for it cannot be assumed that everyone went through this experience simultaneously. There must have been a a vanguard, and if a vanguard, then individuals of curious capacity looked upon by others as veritable gods. The Augustinian knot. But we have to jump forward to the 4th and 5th centuries to get this whole business into perspective, to see the Adam myth transformed into clear-cut conceptual form, destined to shed its mythological guise and assume supposed theological clarity at the hand of Augustine. The Adam and Eve mythology underwent literal translation and became the backbone of the doctrine of original sin, which would dominate Christian thinking for well over 1,000 years. But Augustine did not have it all his own way when making his move from myth to doctrine, from flexible pictorial idea to hard texts, from humanity conceived as made in the image of God and therefore intrinsically good to humanity conceived as intrinsically evil due to Adamic contagion. He met with stiff opposition. For at one stroke he did away with 3 centuries of insistence on human beings having free will, the very basis of the Gospels, and argued that only his jaundiced view of human nature would liberate men from themselves. In her book, Augustine, Philosopher of Freedom, Mary T. Clark may argue that Augustine did not deny the existence of free will as a faculty in historical man after the fall, and that his main denial was the existence of a perfect freedom to do good. But at the end of the day, it was the former and not the latter notion which seems to have held sway. And the point may only be a semantic one anyway. The real point is that Innocent, Bishop of Rome, through fear of losing episcopal authority, accepted Augustine's interpretation after the alternative view put forward by Pelagius, and the idea that episcopal authority was necessary to ensure human salvation became an idea never again to be dislodged. So great was the controversy roused by this debate that riots took place in the streets of Rome in 417 CE between supporters and opponents of the doctrine of original sin. For Augustine's reversal of the concept of human freedom went against the grain of many a Christian, and would later condemn as heretics those who upheld the Church's earlier belief that God had gifted humanity with the will to make moral choices. Gregory of Nyss's view that the soul was self-governed would soon be defunct, and the rabbinic tradition, which saw humanity as made in the living image of the universal king, would fade away with many another shadow of Jewish influence. Yet all of this was in a way unavoidable, for the transplantation of Pauline cum Roman Catholic Christianity from Asia to Europe, from its Galilean birthplace into the Western Greco-Roman world of science and philosophy, meant that its background mythology would inevitably undergo analysis and discussion, and that ill-defined notion of hereditary weakness to be found in the book of Genesis be variously interpreted by thinkers. For as is now known, psychological balance or imbalance governs our decision-making processes, and religious history is studded with examples of dismal doctrines foisted on the religious community by individuals of highly suspect emotional and intellectual balance. I am not suggesting for a moment that Augustine was mad or crazy, or that his doctrine of original sin was political expediency in theological guise. The facts state otherwise, but it cannot be disputed that the Church did derive its enormous power over the individual by embracing this particular idea, in embracing power perhaps over truth, in the rejection of esoteric wisdom teachings and the deep mystical core of Christianity for its orthodox brand. The facts state otherwise, but it cannot be disputed that the Church did derive its enormous power over the individual by embracing this particular idea. And Augustine's confessions do reveal a mind inordinately preoccupied with the concept of human sin against God, or to be more exact, sex. In his 1924 Bampton Lectures, Norman Williams describes Augustine's influence on historical Christianity thus: a giant personality such as his might be expected to have the effect of warping and drawing out of proportion the thought of his age, much as the passage of a comet near the solar system has the effect of perturbing and distorting the orbits of the planets. This is perhaps even more truth to this metaphor than Norman Williams realized, for it could be argued that Augustine distorted ancient truths and helped kill off recognition of the natural resonance between myth and psyche, and that we are still suffering the consequences. But why such a dreary view? Perhaps because he had experienced his own will as impotent against the ravages of sexual desire. So therein lies the vilifying or the demonizing of the body. Seeing his own will as divided against itself, but interpreting this as his will in the hands of an quote-unquote enemy, he excused himself at the personal level and concluded that the enemy was human nature, the nature bequeathed to him as a son of Adam. Human freedom was a lie, the desire to master one's own will an aberration. Adam and Eve may well have had free will to start with, but they used it to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and from that moment chose self-will as their master instead of God. This seems to have been the crux of Augustine's thinking. The heart of his vision, self-will, was a human capacity used against God. So there we have the making of the theology of world or body versus spirit, or against, or world versus God, over and against world. The will to master one's will, to bring it under control, was for Augustine not a natural right given to man from God, but in a curiously contorted fashion, the very basis of his capacity to do the will of God, free will, self-autonomy, and self-government, were illusions of the soul, which made a mockery of God's all-powerful existence. Augustine's vision of human nature as fallen from the very start was basically a heretical idea that caught on because the Church was temporarily under immense pressure from Gnosticism. The spearhead of the Gnostic movement was the powerful Marcionite Church, a natural outgrowth of Christian Samaritan theology, absorbed and adopted by Paul, which at this point evolved into a highly dualistic system, which threatened to replace the established Catholic Church with its own esoteric version of Christian teaching. This very real threat led to a speedy development within the Church of the canon of the New Testament, the baptismal creeds, and the universal episcopate through systematic expositions of Orthodox Christianity. The fathers of the sub-apostolic Church may have argued for humanity's intrinsic goodness and freedom, and the New Testament may have vaunted the freedom of the individual over that of the power of the state. But with the Marcionite heretics breathing down their necks, Catholic thinkers were forced to examine and delineate what up until then had been mysteries hidden from profane eyes. Self-defense was the name of the game, and a rapid consolidation of Christian doctrine was the result. So we have the 66-book canon coming out of that, the authorized King James Version. Prior to this period, the fixed doctrinal conceptions with which we are all familiar simply did not exist. And that, in spite of Paul's writings, the infant church had carried a generally diffused and often confused body of doctrine, and it was not until around 130 CE that Irenaeus began to frame systematic expositions of church thinking. So here we have the birth of churchianity. Continuing, and how modern Irenaeus was in his thinking concerning what Eileen Pagels calls the politics of paradise can hardly be imagined. Augustine must have shuddered to read this early church father in full flight. With one stroke, Irenaeus destroys Augustine's jaundiced view by pointing out that if the serpent had truly tempted Eve, God was himself the author of sin, and there was equally no sense in blaming the serpent's ability to speak on some demon, for if that had been the case, it was a trick demons would never have ceased to use in their deception of human beings. This and other similar rationalizing criticisms to be found in the writings of Irenaeus concerning the fall story reveal a mind fully cognizant of the story's allegorical sense, or deeply embedded esoteric wisdom. He may treat the existence of Adam and Eve as a literal event, but he is in no way fooled by the veiled language of the text. He is on this occasion more interested in moral than parable. In reading between the lines than slavishly accepting a myth as historical truth, I would add that there is indeed a historical, literal interpretation which must be considered, because some of the Genesis writings and can be found in the Old Testament are indeed historical events that really did happen, but it's interwoven with myth and mystical interpretations, which is one thing that makes the Bible truly unique among sacred texts. Continuing, it is a pity he did not use this ability to recognize allegory when dealing with the ideas of the Christian Gnostics. In a careful exposition of Irenaeus' point of view, Norman Williams goes as far as to say that Irenaeus' Adam belongs, in respect of his moral status, to the category of hominid or sub-men rather than to that of Homo sapiens, but for the fact that his early home was an extra-mundane third heaven, he might pass for the immediate progenitor of the semi-human race of Neanderthal. And Williams isn't finished. He adds, if the primitive Hellenistic Christian conception of man's primeval state had never been overlaid by the rabbinical imagination as to Adam's supernatural perfection and splendor, later Christianity might have been spared even the appearance of a conflict with evolution, or in this sense, Darwinism. And that's been a brief reading of some of the content found in Douglas Lockhart's thesis entitled Jesus the Heretic. There's a lot of Christian history in there that many are ignorant of, unfortunately. And that's another reason why I would recommend that book to those who are searching for truth among a wide array of half-truths and outright lies concerning history of Christendom as a whole and church history as well.